Thank you very much, and apologies for the slightly late start. It's entirely my fault, stuck in Delhi traffic. But I'm delighted that we are here to confront one of the compelling questions of our time. Is the end of the liberal order upon us? And juxtaposed with a slightly unrelated question, is it the beginning of the Asian century? There has been an increasing conviction, as you all know, that the system that was established in 1945, underpinning the new global consensus, the Bretton Woods institutions, the United Nations, the liberal international order, which was of course upheld by Western democratic institutions, and which seemed in many ways to reach its peak with the end of the Cold War, is now in tatters while a new Asian century rises, and Asian countries, notably China and India, triumph, doing what the West had in the past taken for granted as its domain. Now, we've got some very interesting voices here to address these questions. I'm going to start with the former Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper. In interest of time, I will not be going into anyone's individual biography, just a one-sentence, one-phrase description. So with that word, let me hand over to Stephen Harper.
Great, thank you very much, and wonderful to be back here at Ricina. Look, I'll try and address the question this way. I don't think there's an inherent tension between a liberal international order and an Asian century. I'll maybe come back to that a little bit, but I think it matters a lot in terms of what we understand as this liberal international order. I would say in maybe the most extreme form, which is probably post-Cold War, the idea that in maybe some significant ways, national sovereignty would actually be overridden by global institutions. We talk about things like the extension of human rights and democratic governance as a matter of principle, of right to protect, for instance, international law. I think the truth of the matter is that kind of view of a liberal international order has never really been one that's, in practice, been widely accepted anyway. Among some member states of the EU, there has been the voluntary surrender of sovereignty to supranational or international bodies, but even in the West, I don't think that view has ever really been accepted by states, and is certainly not accepted outside of the West. Now, what you talked about in your opening comments, more the post-war period of not a surrendering of sovereignty, but institutions that embody an ongoing cooperative approach to sovereignty. International economic institutions like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, certain established practices, United Nations, international security through the Security Council. I think we can say that there's been some erosion of that. I'm not sure we can point that to an Asian phenomenon. There are countries in parts of the world that are and forces that are questioning some aspects of traditional international cooperation, certainly in the trade area. There have been well-known incidents of countries, how do I put it, try to put it diplomatically, of countries kind of ignoring established international rules in terms of some aspects of their foreign policy. I think, for example, of some of the Chinese activities in the South China Sea, Russian activities in Ukraine, and for that matter, I think you'd put the American invasion of Iraq in a similar kind of category. But as I say, I don't think that these, this may be in some jeopardy, but I don't think we've seen that order erode. I think that by and large, the states of the world today understand that the health of the global economy and international security depend on a high degree of cooperation, on a fairly high degree of respect for institutions, and a fairly high degree of cooperative practice. I think the exceptions are there. I think there's some reason to be concerned about the Chinese exception. I do think we see, whether it's the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, some of Chinese approaches to trade, I mentioned the South China Seas, I do think we see a bit of a shift from the post-war order as defined by rules and institutions, albeit American-led, to a Chinese order that is more explicitly simply about Chinese national interest. It's not a radical change, but I think it's something we should be concerned about or should watch. The third interpretation, maybe not the word liberal, but of international order, is simply the old Westphalian interpretation of guiding principles of state sovereignty. And beyond some of the military things I mentioned, I think the one and only real challenge to that kind of order is, frankly, jihadism, which is a pre-Westphalian notion that there are transcendental values that need to be imposed outside and beyond the state system, and even the state system itself should be abolished. Now, look, obviously west of India, parts of Western Asia, Northern Africa, I think we see this as a very real concern in certain regions. And obviously the threat of global terrorism, particularly jihadist terrorism, is something that affects all of us. But is this actually a threat to the world order as a whole? I think we realistically have to say not. Big security concern, but not a threat to the order. So, and let me just wrap this up in terms of what does the rise of Asia do to the liberal world order? Does it threaten it or not? I think it maybe threatens to transform the power relationships, not in ways that should fundamentally endanger the order, but I think it makes a big difference who leads that. I think, to be blunt here, if it's strictly China as the emerging power, I think there are more threats to the liberal aspect of the world order than, say, if it's a free and democratic society like India that is also playing a major role in the power structures of the future.
Let me push you a little bit on your earlier point, though, about liberal international institutions, because if you look, for example, at something like the Bretton Woods institutions,
right,
those who are sitting on top of them have been notoriously reluctant to admit new interlopers. So till, what was it, January, February 2016, the Chinese had the same weighted vote as Belgium, until the US Senate finally implemented what had been agreed in Pittsburgh in 2008. Now, the question that comes up is this. What does China do? It goes off and sets up the Asian Infrastructure Bank. It sets up the new development bank under BRICS. It's basically saying, okay, so if you won't give us a different playing field, we'll go and build our own playing field. Isn't that the construction, incipient, of an alternative international order? And can we not criticize the custodians of the international order for not having the imagination to accommodate new countries in it?
Well, I would broadly agree with some of the things you said. I was obviously part of the process that came to an agreement to alter voting shares at these various international financial institutions. But the fact of the matter is, there was pretty rapid and broad acceptance when we engaged in that dialogue on what needed to be done, and we came to an agreement. And unfortunately, it really was essentially the US Senate that held up the agreement. There was pretty broad consensus around this, including from successive American administrations. So I think that was unfortunate. That partly explains the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. But I would point out, and where we should be concerned, is that the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is still fundamentally different. And that is not merely trying to shift, as I read the structure, and I continue to read the structure, not merely trying to shift from a bank where certain countries had more say and others had less to a change in shares, but one where the bank was still fundamentally decided by a consensus versus one where the Chinese essentially just set the rules by themselves. And I think that we should be a bit concerned about, even if I understand the frustration that contributed to that process.
Fair point. Thank you, Prime Minister Harper. Let me turn to a second voice, Ina Lepel, Director General for Asia and the Pacific at the Federal Foreign Office in Germany. You have the floor.
Well, thank you. I would first of all point out that in our understanding, the liberal international order is not and has never been a static concept. It evolved over time, and it has seen several different environments in which it has worked fairly well. So in the 20th century, from the ashes of the Second World War and the bedrock and foundation, as you said, of the Westphalian order, a bipolar world emerged, and the structures of international governments like the UN and Bretton Woods institutions were created. But the system was greatly hampered by the fierce antagonism of the two blocs, who did not always play by the rules. And after the end of the Cold War, there was indeed a unipolar moment, and the proclamation of the end of history by a famous American political scientist. At that point, it looked like Western liberal ideas in politics and economics, such as democracy, human rights, and free trade, seemed to have prevailed at last and for good. But of course, the end of history didn't last long. With the return of countries like China and India to their historical position of political clout and economic influence, the power and legitimacy of the West, in quotation marks, to shape the world and spread its values is increasingly being questioned. That has also been helped, of course, by internal developments in the West, like the Brexit vote in Britain or the America First reflexes in the US. And it becomes clear that the world is once again in flux, and not just because of the eastern shift of economic power, but for a number of reasons. Some speak of a new age of disorder and instability, and there is that thesis of this panel that the dominance of the West and the liberal order associated with it are coming to an end and giving way to a new Asian century. But I would question that this is actually the case so stringently. And the other question is, what does the Asian century really mean with regard to political order? Even in Asia, there would be different answers to this question depending on who you ask. There is a more and more powerful China with its interesting mix of one-party communist rule and kind of capitalism. But at the other same time, we have India, the biggest democracy and soon the most populous country in the world, which is a very vibrant economy and democracy. And then we find countries like Japan or South Korea or Australia, which would certainly continue to mostly support the liberal world order that has worked so well. And of course, that would go for the Western countries themselves as well. And then there is Russia with its own concept of order in Eurasia and a somewhat classical thinking in terms of spheres of influence. And all these concepts of political order, all these value systems, and all these economic approaches seem to be quite diverse in this so-called Asian century. Thus, what we might see in the future is just an increasing competition and hopefully some overlap and cooperation of different concepts of order in the world. Free trade and multilateral cooperation in a rules-based system, however, have helped lift hundreds of millions of Asians out of poverty. And I think there are many things in favor of saying that these elements of the liberal order can no longer be considered purely Western concept, and I would be fairly confident that they will continue to be part of the Asian century. We should not take a too defensive view about defending the liberal order in the new Asian century. We also need to reform this concept of order. Because, as we have discussed before, especially the institutions no longer correspond to the global realities of today. And for such a reform effort, we need partners. And as Germany, in case of Germany, I would believe that India is an excellent partner for that. Since the international liberal order has proven quite apt at adapting to changed realities, I think we will just have to work and see how much order and how much liberalism there will be at the end of such a process. Certainly, ideas of democracy and human rights will be subject to more competition maybe than they used to. But India, with its democratic traditions, pluralism, and economic vibrancy, can be a champion of the reformed liberal order. And ideally, this would happen with the reinvigorated European Union as a partner, which invests in its core interests and helps preserve a set of liberal rules and values in this coming more complicated and certainly, like our minister used to say, much less comfortable world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ina. Let me push you on that last point, because you speak of a reinvigorated European Union, but you'll forgive observers elsewhere in the wake of Brexit, looking at the European Union as a somewhat shaky institution. Do you see the exit of the British actually reinvigorating the EU?
Well, not in a direct sense, but I think it has been a very much needed wake-up call to see that this institution also needs some kind of reinvigoration. And I think this whole effort that is going on is showing that we really need to be more together and to work on the differences that are there. And I think slowly, also with President Macron, some ideas in that sense are coming, and they will hopefully work in favor of such a solution.
Let's hope you're right. All right, let me turn to James Carafano, Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation, Washington. You have the floor.
So the answer is no. Liberal order is fine. What's it going to look like in the future? I have no freaking idea. But I believe the catalyst for it is going to be born in the Asian century, but not because of the rise of China, but because of the four great liberal democracies, the United States, Japan, India, and Australia. And not because they're democracies. I mean, the United States and India have been the two world's democracies for like forever. We've never had very close relations. What's driven us together is the strategic convergence. And so I think it is the strategic convergence of the four countries which is going to lead the way. And let me give 4 reasons why I believe that from the American perspective. The first is the United States looks at allies and friends differently. We built up strong alliances during the Cold War, and then what we did is, because we recognized that these were special countries that we need to have special relationships in, we built all kinds of laws and everything else to strengthen that. And the result of that is now the laws define who our allies can be. So unless you're an ally, we can't do all these things with you, because the laws say all we can't do. And I think this administration recognizes that's not working. We don't care what you call it. If we're a strategic partner, we have to do things together. The laws have to conform to our strategic needs. And so I think that obstacle is really going away, particularly if you look at relationships, for example, like the United States and India. We're going to be doing all the things allies do. We just don't call them allies. And it's not just in Asia. I think we see that in Europe, for example, with countries like Norway. The second thing is what I think what's really driving this is everybody fixates on the institutions and the structures, and these countries aren't waiting for the institutions and the structures to modernize and catch up with what needs to be done. And I think we really need to focus on what's really changing things, is much in the way the great power conferences after World War II really helped kind of shape that, and then they kind of dissipated and went away as institutions replaced them. The trilaterals, whether it's US, India, Japan, or India, Japan, Australia, and the Quad, US, India, Australia, and the United States, this, I think, is where a lot of the hard work is really getting done. In not just kind of helping thinking what are the roots of the road, but aligning the power structures underneath that, because rule-based orders are there because somebody is there to enforce the rules. And so I think that hard work's already really started. The third one I want to say is this concept of the Indo-Pacific, which is, I think, key for the United States. If you really unpack our strategy, there's a commitment in the United States that for us to be a global power, we really need peace and stability in 3 key parts of the world: Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. And I mean, that recognition is a strong, really, a commitment of the United States to the prolonging of a global liberal order. And what's important about the Indo-Pacific concept is two things. One is it's a broader concept of Asia, of where the United States really needs to engage in order to be a true Asian power and be a real contributor to peace and stability in the region. But more importantly, the Indo-Pacific concept links the three critical regions together: Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. And I think it really does reflect this kind of global perspective that's going to emerge out of the cooperation between the four countries. And the last is I think we have reached a pivot point. You know, I think we floundered a lot post-1989 into what we all needed to do in the world. I mean, if you look at the United States, we just, jumped from Bush to Clinton to Bush to Obama, and everybody kind of did their thing because we didn't have really, I think, a driving bipartisan consensus in the big things that really needed to get done. I think that's changed. I think the changes that leaders like Modi and Abe and Trump are making are not just political changes because they're a different political party or they have a different thing or something. I think they reflect a growing realization of what the liberal order thinks it needs to do in order to sustain that. So I would say if Hillary Clinton were president today, eventually her foreign policy would not look terribly different from Donald Trump. It might take her longer to get there because there's a legacy from the past administration. But she would be aligning with leaders like Modi and Abe because I think this reflects much in the way we had this kind of clarifying moment between 45 and 55, not that we're headed for a new Cold War, but this clarifying moment of the big things that really need to get done. I think that's happening, and I think we're going to see less of the big flip-flops among those countries in their foreign policies going forward.
But
see, I want your job. This isn't fair. You get to ask the really hard questions.
That's right.
So I got the wrong job on the panel.
Well, and you're at the opposite end, so let me ask you right away. Are we not at the same time, you talk about the importance for the US, in the interest of global stability, of peace in Asia, for example, and stability and predictability there, but isn't the US in the process of retrenching a little bit from the world and thereby diminishing in its ability to determine the course of events in Asia or indeed in any other far-reaching corner?
I thought I was going to get the tough question. I mean, no, of course not. Look, I would say, this is the president's national security strategy. I mean, so one of the criticisms, as I say, is, okay, it's a big, long document. He probably hasn't read it. He's just going to do whatever he wants. I mean, that is false. This is the president's document. This is the president's vision of what the United States government is going to do. You read through those long, and the reason why it's so long, against my advice, was because they really felt, because you cannot get a sense of what American foreign policy is by tweets and comments and everything else. Tell me about it. Read what we're actually going to do. So I would say if you read that document and then you come away and want to argue with me that America's in retreat, then we can duke it out.
But what about the resources to sustain that document?
Well, that's a great question. So I think diplomatically, just kind of all the hub, I actually think we're going to be in a better place. I don't think it's about a retreat from soft power. But the structural realignment that's going on is about making American statecraft truly match up with what America's interests are. So I'm actually more sanguine on that. I'm actually semi-optimistic on the trade front because I think in many ways our trade policy will wind up being more traditional than people think. And I think we're in for some exciting things in terms of some of the other instruments and how we do economic engagement, particularly about engaging our private sector in that. The one where I actually marry worse is on the military front. I mean,
and the State Department's budget, too.
No, I'm not worried about the State Department's budget because it actually hasn't gone down. But if you look at what the national security strategy calls for, which is to be strong in Asia, be strong and engage in the Middle East, be strong and engage in Europe, that's awesome. But if you look at our defense strategy, it's not matched to do that. The defense strategy will be out soon. I'm not optimistic it's going to be matched, and our budgets aren't matched to do that. So if we keep running at this pace, we're going to run the reels off to that. So we don't need Reagan-era double-digit increases in defense, but we do need sustained increases in defense over time, both to modernize our military and get our readiness back up, but also to send a signal to the competitors in the world that the United States is in this for the long game. So the defense budget is the one I would watch to see if we truly will match our commitments to our aspirations.
Fascinating. All right, let's now turn to Teresa Fallon, who's a Brussels-based analyst, director for the Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies. What a great job description that must be.
I live in Brussels. It's a land of acronyms, and Eurasia was already taken, so it's CRIAS. First of all, namaste. It's such an honor to be here. I'm thrilled. I came to India about 30 years ago as a freshly minted political science major, and my volunteer time in India really taught me I needed to learn a lot more about economics. So this kind of was an inflection point when I first came to India, and I never dreamed that I would be here at Vicina, which didn't exist back then, but to talk about the difficulties of the global liberal order. So the liberal international order, if we look at the history of it, it's about 200 years old. And after 200 years, almost everything gets a bit creaky and needs reform. But the post-liberal, the post-war order is now 70 years old. And we do see rising powers, and we were all expecting them to have a role. But what we missed was that the democracies would be where the crisis is. Freedom House just released a report, and we all are familiar with the new authoritarianism in Hungary, Poland, the Philippines, and Turkey, China, and Russia, but the US made the list. Now, I don't think many people would have guessed a few years ago that the US would be on this list. So globalization success has actually created this unanticipated blowback. And there was one other question that we were asked on the panel, so I'm going to try to answer that, or at least my views on that at this point. One of the questions we were asked is, has globalization success paradoxically led to convergence of values between the governments of East and West? So in Washington, D.C., I'm a neutral analyst. I'm supposed to, try to be a neutral observer and try to figure out what's going on. So I try not to take any position, just try to figure out where we are headed. But there were panda huggers in Washington, D.C., there were panda sluggers in Washington, D.C., and we've seen an evolution that once China became a member of the international system, once they joined the WTO, they would become very much like the rest of the liberal democracies. But we haven't seen that happen, so this was an unanticipated consequence. But what has happened is that China has influenced the West more than the West has been able to influence China. For example, I can think of a recent Cambridge University Press, the acronym is CUP, one of the leading journals in the world. Well, in order to get into the Chinese market, they were asked to censor many of their articles, and they agreed to this. So when a well-known academic journal will do anything, really, even self-censor, to get into the Chinese market, we have to ask ourselves, do we really believe in the values that the West or the liberal democracies espouse? And I can think of another example. I don't want to just pick on Cambridge University Press, which actually reversed their decision after outrage around the world by academics. But another publisher, a German publisher, Springer, has also agreed to self-censor. So we really have to wonder, is it just the rise of another power, or is it the erosion of values within the system? So I knew I was going to be speaking towards the end, and I expected the other speakers to fill these questions, so I tried to come up with another angle. So I just proposed 3 scenarios, because it's so difficult. It's such an uncertain time that we live in. So the first is, perhaps I called scenario 1, a crisis of transition. So the US-led political foundation obviously is eroding. We have a Trumpism turning inward. They're not as big of a player. So what will this new configuration of global power, what will it look like, the new coalition of states? We had that incredible speech yesterday with Netanyahu saying that the Indian Prime Minister, it was the first time in 3,000 years he had visited Israel. So, I mean, we have this interesting growth of new governance institutions, coalitions of states. The second scenario is a deep crisis. I mean, is this really serious? We're seeing, even within the European Union, or we've seen Brexit. We have a lot of fears about what's happening in Central and Eastern Europe with Poland and Hungary. We're also seeing internationally the global order is giving way to various mixtures of nationalism, protectionism, spheres of influence, and regional great power projects. So how is this all going to look? And then we also have, Davos this year is coming up very quickly. And last year, Xi Jinping, it was the first time a Chinese leader spoke there, and he came across in this kind of Alice in Wonderland looking glass world as a protector of globalization. Well, if you talk to most, and he got a standing ovation for his speech, but if you really look at what's happening in China and all these companies who want to do business there, it's far more difficult to enter China now than in the past. Chinese investments have dramatically increased in Europe, and Europeans are finding it far more difficult to do business and invest in China. So this idea of Tiansha, all under heaven, this kind of old vassal states, everyone turns to China. And under Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative, some call it OBOR, One Belt, One Road, others call it One Belt, One Way, and another one is One Belt, One Trap. So we saw recently with Habontata, very important for India, in Sri Lanka, this port, they had so much debt, so in almost a repeat of what happened with Hong Kong, China said, don't worry about the debt, you just hand us sign over the port for 99 years. So this is right in India's strategic neighborhood. So we see a new kind of debt trap diplomacy that we hadn't anticipated before. And China, and most of the people I've spoken to, they all look at them with great awe. I mean, they're amazed by what they've been able to do in such a short period of time. And so I know I have just a couple minutes here, so but I think that the Chinese model is not a model that the rest of the world finds appealing, and neither perhaps even Russia's model. So we have a crisis right now and transformations in the liberal international order. And then to just wind it up here, Thomas Hobbes warned that hell is truth seen too late. Now we've seen in 3 out of the 4 most recent Economist covers, we've seen pandas on them or sharp-powered China's unmasking of their United Front work throughout the world. Australia has been focused on New Zealand. Confucius Institutes are around the world. Europe is, China has a great deal of influence in the Central and Eastern Europe. So we've seen that even if the EU, for example, after the arbitral tribunal decision, their hands were tied because of Chinese investments, and all they need is 1 or 2 states to actually side with them. And so the EU was unable to even come up with support for international rule of law with the arbitral tribunal decision in July. So if the European Union, which is really based on rule of law, is unable to hold these up, I think we really are in a very serious crisis. So to conclude, in Brussels, we're always talking about resilience because the EU global strategy, everyone's like, they even have conferences, what does resilience mean? So resilience is almost like the Belt and Road, it can mean anything, and it's very stretchy. But I think what we need to do now, and in a very important country like India, liberal internationalism will need to be rethought and reinvented. You spoke earlier about reform. I suggest for your next conference, we should have a panel on the reforms. What really, it's nice to say we should reform, but really, how should these reforms be done? And so in the land of acronyms, I propose RAILY. Respond to technological change, shifting demographics and modernity. So we need a rejuvenated liberal internationalism, or you can substitute resilience in there. So to conclude, John Eikenberry recently wrote, "To bet on the future of the global liberal order is a little bit like a second marriage, a triumph of hope over experience." Thanks.
Allusions to marriage always work very well, as you've noticed, adult audiences. Just to say, though, that when you talk in terms of what kind of order, what's interesting about today's challenges to the liberal international order is, in fact, unlike, say, Germany and Japan at the beginning of the 20th century, what countries like China and India at the beginning of the 21st seem to want is just a place at the high table. They don't want to upturn the existing order. They want to be accommodated within it. And so what they're really asking for, I mean, in international affairs, you're either at the table or on the menu. And they want to make sure that you can make room for them. There seems to be some reluctance to make room for them.
As you pointed out earlier, AIIB, because the US Congress wouldn't vote for them to have an improved position at the IMF. So I do understand China's frustration. And would they have gone ahead, even if they had the reforms, would the AIIB gone ahead? I suspect it would, because why would you keep investing in US bonds when you have all these reserves and you can actually improve your neighborhood and buy a lot of friends and improve infrastructure and grow markets? So I think China wants room at the table, but I think that their heft and their long-term strategy. I know no one likes to think China has a strategy, but that's the best strategy of all, letting everyone think you don't have a strategy. So I think that they have a very, and I admire, I mean, I'm amazed by what they have been able to accomplish.
Yeah.
You have to stand in awe. If you look at what China was like 30 years ago and where they are now. So I agree that these international institutions are creaky and they need updating. And that means that maybe some countries like France and Britain might have to rethink their positions. And that's something that nobody wants to talk about, especially in Europe. But I think we do need to update.
Maybe we'll get someone from the audience to talk about it when we turn to them. Final voice from the panel, Igor Morgulov was Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, looking particularly at Asia. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you. Shashi, thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of such a distinguished panel. And also thank you for giving me the last word, because as they say, the last word is, remembered best of all. Let me mention just a couple of points, given that a lot of ideas were already presented here. First of all, I would like to say that Asia is not a purely geographical concept anymore. It is a dynamically expanding political and economic space, which literally draw in others, non-regional actors, entire regions. And we witness how barriers dividing civilizations for ages, for centuries, are being erased here now. And what is really important, it is Asia, not the Western world, who is leading this process, who set pace for this process. So East is East and West is not working anymore. Asia, this is my second point, displays to us new methods and new models that are fundamentally different from what we see, for example, in Europe, where so-called pan-European conscience is promoted. It means that in the core, here in Asia, we are looking for not standardization and unification of everything. We are not talking about pseudo-tolerance here, often resulting in rejection of traditional values and views. But we are talking here in Asia about creative interaction within the framework of various political systems and various ways of life. Diversity, this is a very important word in my view. And implementing such approach in Asia is all the more important given the fact that the space of constructing cooperation globally is unfortunately shrinking due to the fact that so-called liberal West is unwilling to recognize objective reality of the new multipolar world which is emerging and in which countries like India, China, Russia, ASEAN are new poles, new centers of gravity. My third point would be that Asia, and to be precise, not the Asia, but ASEAN, which I have already mentioned, this association gave to the world the concept of connectivity. Never before we heard this word. I mean, we were talking about, globalization or building unions based on geography or politics or blocks, but never before we were talking about connectivity. And today's Asia has a growing desire not to be divided by blocks or by unions, but to build a common space of interaction and mutual interest. In trade and economy, it manifests itself in determination to build a common open and non-discriminatory market, ensuring equal access to existing economic opportunities. These are exactly the basis on which ASEAN is functioning, on which Shanghai Cooperation Organization is functioning, and also Eurasian Economic Union, to which Russia is a member. And by the way, let me congratulate India with succession to Shanghai Cooperation Organization in July last year. And point number 4, speaking on economic front, this is exactly the idea of harmonizing the emerging integration networks and creating coalition for the shared growth that lays behind the idea of President Putin of the Greater Eurasian Partnership, which he put forward in December 2015. And Russia hoped that this partnership will include members of course, Eurasian Economic Union, but Shanghai Cooperation Organization as well, and ASEAN countries as well, but not only them. It is open to all Eurasian nations and blocs, including European Union. European Union is also welcome to participate in this great Eurasian endeavor. And finally, on political front, here we also see diversity. I mean, Asia demonstrates leadership in developing multilateral formats, as well as promoting network diplomacy, which help us to, find collective answers to the challenges which we have and which we all know. And I also want to mention here ASEAN-led mechanisms like EAS, Eurasian East Asian Summits, ARF, ADMM+, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and others. So our region is moving forward through consolidation potentials of the leading centers of power, which is crucial for the new multipolar world. The 3 largest Asian nations, Russia, India, China, as well as others, are among those who jointly search for effective answers to key global and regional issues. And we believe that such collective and well-coordinated approach helps us to create huge positive energy in the region. And also, I want to mention that Russia is proposing, actually we launched already a multilateral dialogue on regional security architecture. We believe that it is needed for Asia. We need some efficient systemic response to the complex challenges that we have. It can in particular take the form of the era of non-bloc Asia that requires, of course, regionally recognized rules of games. So Russia proposed to develop such rules of games, and this work has already started. We do it together with India, China, some ASEAN members in ASEAN, particularly in Jakarta. There are regular meetings of permanent representatives to ASEAN Secretariat discussing this issue of regional architecture. And who knows, maybe one day Asia will set a good example in this field to say Europe, who once renounced the idea of pan-European security treaty, which Russia proposed.
But if you were to look now at the global picture, one thing you haven't talked about, just a little over a year ago, we witnessed the election of the most pro-American, pro-Russian American president in decades. And yet we are seeing Russia-America relations in rather bad shape. Can you envisage a rejuvenated global system without the Americans and the Russians talking constructively to each other?
Yeah, but you're right. Of course, we need good Russian-American relations. And as you know, my president on many occasions said that we are ready to have an equal, mutually respectful relations with the United States, and we are open for the constructive dialogue. In some sense, I agree with you that obviously, the world requires such normal relations between two major powers. But at the same time, speaking about Asia, I would like to stress that what is important here in Asia, that we are developing relations with big countries like China, India, ASEAN, others, without any, looking after what Americans are thinking about this and what they will be doing to counter this. Our relations with Asia has its own significance and importance. So for us, it's a matter of our strategic choice, not a matter of how it will, be reflected in our bilateral dialogue with the United States.
Okay, well, that's a striking thing. Now, we're going to open it up to the audience in the remaining 10 minutes. As you know, the Resina Young Fellows at the back there have the first two questions, and the rest of you can contemplate yours very quickly. I'll first ask Christopher Elms for his question. Please tell the panel who you are, and if you want to address your question to a particular panelist, do so, or just cast it into the open air, and we'll see who'd like to answer.
Sure. I'm Chris. I'm a diplomat at the U.S. Embassy here in New Delhi. My question is to Mr. Carafano on the world order in the Asian century. The national security strategy notes that we will continue to lead and defend our interests in international institutions, but that post-World War II institutions need reform. You noted how we are pursuing our interests in the Indo-Pacific with our democratic strategic partners here. But Dr. Tharoor noted to Prime Minister Harper how the West, we, the United States included, have been reluctant to cede power in these post-World War II international institutions. Should we be more aggressively pursuing reform of post-World War II institutions that protect our interests and those of our allies and partners, or should we be more aggressively pursuing the interests and strategic partnerships in the Indo-Pacific?
James.
Yeah, so great, thanks, because I get to use my line. I actually think this narrative that the problem here is people just didn't get a seat at the table is getting pretty thin. I don't think people are really buying that anymore. We all used to have panda huggers and panda haters, and now the panda huggers are hugging the panda haters. At best we have panda skeptics and panda haters. So the answer is, I think it's going to be a bit of both. The institutions cannot reform themselves. And I think what you're seeing is states are leading the way in establishing new norms. And I imagine what will happen is some of the institutions will conform to the new norms and they'll remain because they're useful. And some, like the League of Nations, will get supplanted by other ones. So I think it's premature to talk about what is the structural system of the next couple of decades going to look like when we're done. I don't. This presumption that somehow this stuff comes out of whole cloth. It's not like in 1945 we knew exactly which institutions were going to make it and which ones didn't. They evolved over time, and I think that's what we're going to have here again. So I think just take the notion off of we know exactly what an institution is going to look like. They're going to evolve to meet the needs of the future, and so it's premature to answer the question of which ones are going to be there and what they're going to look like. But keeps us employed for the next couple of decades, that's all I care about.
Actually, that is a fair answer, Chris. If you look at the UN Charter, for example, the way the UN was envisaged, if you read, for example, Chapter 7, it's very different from the way in which the UN actually worked, but it did meet the needs of the world. Laura Mayer has the next question.
Hi, thank you. My name is Laura Meyer, and I'm with SoftBank Robotics. In 2007, 18 billion of cheap capital was invested in solar panel companies in China. And by 2015, 7 of the top 10 solar panel manufacturers were Chinese. So my question is, with the Made in China goals for 2025, how are we in the West going to stay competitive and stay leaders in artificial intelligence, robotics, and all these areas? Because Japan, and I definitely assume India will be leading the way in technology investment in this area. And my main concern is, from a US perspective, we are focused on saving jobs in dying industries and really focused on political points in our rhetoric by politicians at the state.
Are you addressing that question to anyone?
Yes, sorry, to either Mr. Carafano or Ms. Fallon.
Okay, since James has had a word, would you like to go ahead, Teresa?
Thank you. That's an excellent question.
I think Prime Minister Harper
2000
might want to chip in
okay.
also after you.
2016, February, we saw a huge inflection point in Europe because the whole idea is free trade, Asia's far away. I read somewhere an analyst said maybe in 30 years we'll have to start worrying about China. So they have a very different perspective, and many people say we don't do geopolitics. The European Union doesn't do geopolitics. So there was this feeling that they could sell any items to Asia or specifically China, and it wouldn't have any blowback. But we saw with the KUKA sale, Germany has 12 major robotics companies, but KUKA is actually the very best, #1, and China bought it. And there was this wonderful ad on the internet, if you saw it, the KUKA manufacturers had a KUKA mechanical arm play ping pong with the world's leading ping pong player, and I wondered if that's why China's like, that's the one we want, we gotta buy that company. But within 2 months of the sale, analysts have discovered that German engineers are now designing things for the PLA, the People's Liberation Army of China. So this is really a dangerous precedent. And so what we see, and it's not a precedent, it's going on all the time, this technology transfer. And what does that mean for the US? Because if the narrative, it's a very sketchy narrative, because if Europeans are finding it difficult to make their NATO dues, but while at the same time selling high-tech equipment to China, which is fueling the military machine in China, it's really not a very beautiful narrative about transatlantic relations. So I think this, we saw with France, Germany, and Italy submitting a letter to the European Parliament and the Commission about a FDI screening mechanism, foreign direct investment screening mechanism. Now this was a big deal because about 3 years ago, I tried to interview people and I said, it will never happen at the EU level, it will just never happen. And then they would look at CFIUS, so would there be a CFIU in Europe? But CFIUS, as we saw in the US, is also, it's like whack-a-mole. I mean, it's very difficult. They have these rules, but then the Chinese study it and say, well, if we buy under this level of investment and have these shell companies, they are able to do it. So it's very difficult to trace the money, and we see them buy one small Silicon Valley company, and they invest in bigger and bigger companies. So they're able to get the technology, and it's very, very difficult to stop it. CFIUS is actually being reformed, but I really do find it's a battle to keep up. So how are they going to compete? This is when finally the Europeans said, we can't say no to China. Germany is one of the biggest. We see a change in China's investment patterns in Europe, and they're looking at high tech. All the high tech they can't buy in the US, they turn to Europe. So Europe is finally, at least they have proposed a screening mechanism, but because of Chinese investments that already exist in Europe, I don't know if it will get off the ground. Or if it does, it will be a very watered down, weak version. So this is, watch this page. It's going to be very
Watch this space. Stephen Harper, do you want to chip in on this issue? Or you?
Well, I mean, I could make a comment about the question. There was a kind of a framing in the question that would suggest that, look, the Chinese model is really investing in high tech and oriented that way, and the American model is not. And I don't think that's accurate. I think what's accurate, what's true, is that these are both technological development leaders, but they do it in entirely different ways. The Chinese do it through a state-directed system, state capitalism, and the American model is through private enterprise. And I work with, venture capital firms in the United States that are leading high tech in all kinds of areas. You tend to get very different priorities in the kind of high tech being developed. But both are, as I say, this is really a clash of models in a sense, which is going to work. I think the example of solar panels and solar technology is a great one. There has been private investment in that, and for the most part, it's been a failure and unprofitable. The Chinese have decided to go into it in a big way, longer term, not as sensitive to immediate market returns. A state capitalist model gives you that kind of scope, so it gives you the scope, in a sense, to make breakthroughs over a longer term that maybe a market-oriented and genuinely private sector system couldn't do, but it also has the capacity of making enormous failures that aren't corrected for a long time. So I personally would continue to bet on, in terms of resilience and in terms of long-term outcomes, on the American Western-type model of technological development over that, but time will tell.
It's a fascinating debate. Do we have anyone standing at any of the mics? You have to walk up to the mics there. I can ask you to do so. Is there a lady already at the mic there? Yes, go ahead, ma'am.
Hi, my name
Sorry,
is
we only
Christine.
have time for 2 questions, so whoever is keen, you get the next one. Yeah, go ahead.
My name is Christine Chang. I'm from King's College London. And I just have a broad question following up on some of the comments that were made during this session around how do you get countries that have power from that post-World War II order to give up power? Right, so this was a discussion that had happened earlier actually in regards to gender. How do you give people, how do you give the incentives and set up the incentives for those who have that power to find in some way reasons that it is actually in their interest to reform that order? And
That's
I think
right.
that's
So
a
when
tough-
emerging powers are coming, will there be submerging powers on the other side making room for them? Tough
That's
question.
right, and I'd like a sharp answer to this as opposed to a roundabout answer.
Who wants to take that? Any volunteers? We're going to leave that question hanging in
Well,
the air.
maybe,
I just-
I'll say something very quick, which is this. You know, obviously enlightened leaders will, when they see power dynamics changing in the world, will find ways to adapt to that. And as I say, except for the US Senate, I think on the one situation we talked about earlier, there was an overwhelming desire to do that. But the question that's going to be asked by many people is not simply recognizing the shift of power and being prepared to reallocate power, but people are going to worry about how that reallocated power is going to be exercised. And if the reallocated power is going to be exercised in ways that are inconsistent with traditional models of international security or traditional models of trade and trade access, then I think it's going to cause resistance to those kinds of changes.
Fascinating. All right, young man there with the mic. That mic is not working, alas. Can you hear him? Yeah.
Good, not well.
Good evening to one and all. My name is Avinash Dev and I'm Global Solution Advisor for United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions based in New York City. Can't hear you.
Yeah, I'm really sorry you're going to lose that question, so we can have some question that the rest of the panel can hear. Really sorry, you're unlucky with your mic.
Walk behind right here. Walk behind you right here.
You have a mic? All right, go ahead. Sorry.
My name is Nikita.
You have to hold it up to your...
My name is Nikita. My question is directed to the panel. Will the liberal order, be it new or the old, will it survive the wave of immigration which we have seen recently?
The wave of immigration
Immigration
into
into the countries, into Europe, like
into
we have seen-
Europe and America, into the
Yeah,
West, in other
exactly.
words.
Well,
All
you know, I
right,
think that it's a
James?
great metric, right? Because the answer is if they're doing their job right, that the causes of great global migration will stop, right? So the question answers itself. If they keep migrating, they failed. If they stop migrating, they've done their job.
Ina, in Germany, you've got a migration issue. What's your view on this?
Well, I would also say it's a great opportunity for the liberal order to show how it can work, especially the institutions it has created. I think the United Nations are very active in trying to tackle the issue and also in finding fair solutions that are fair to the countries where migrants come from, fair to transit countries, and fair to recipient countries. And well, of course, like Mr. Carafano said, it depends on whether it will work in the end. But I'm fairly optimistic that this is one issue where cooperation can really make a difference. And there can be lots of incentives in trying to work it out.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm getting the clear signal that the next speaker is pawing at the door. Sorry for all those whose hands were up there. Thank you to this outstanding panel for a stimulating discussion.